New York City, 1785. The war was over, and a new nation was finding its feet. But Manhattan wasn't just a political hub. It was the beating heart of American high society. It was here, amidst the grand balls of the temporary capital, that a young veteran named James Monroe would meet his match. Enter Elizabeth Courtwright. At just 17, she was the crown jewel of Manhattan's elite, intelligent, wealthy, and captivating. Their meeting wasn't just a romance, it was the birth of a revolutionary power couple. James, the gritty Virginian, and Elizabeth, the refined socialite, were about to rewrite the rules of American influence. New York City in the year 1785 was a place of frantic energy and precarious hope. The War of Independence had ended only 2 years prior with the Treaty of Paris, and the British troops had finally evacuated the city, leaving behind a population that was eager to rebuild, to redefine itself, and to claim its place on the world stage. It was here, amidst the cobblestone streets and the newly reopened ports of Lower Manhattan, that the Congress of the Confederation had established its temporary capital. The city was a melting pot of revolutionary heroes, foreign diplomats, and wealthy merchant families, all vying for influence in the fragile new republic. The air was thick with the smoke of wood fires and the salt spray of the harbor, but beneath it all, there was a palpable sense of possibility, a feeling that history was being written in real time. Into this swirling vortex of politics and high society stepped James Monroe, a 27-year-old delegate from Virginia. Monroe was not a man who sought the spotlight with the flamboyance of some of his peers. He was a veteran, carrying a musket ball in his shoulder from the Battle of Trenton, a physical reminder of the price of liberty. He was serious, studious, and possessed of a quiet intensity that commanded respect. He had come to New York to serve his country, to debate treaties and trade agreements in the halls of Congress. But fate, as it often does, had a different appointment in mind for him, one that would shape his life far more than any legislative session. The social calendar of post-war New York was a dizzying array of balls, theater performances, and dinner parties. It was the era of the Republican court, where the lines between political maneuvering and social courtship were hopelessly blurred. To be a politician in 1785 was to be a socialite, and it was on this glittering stage that Monroe first laid eyes on Elizabeth Courtwright. She was 17 years old, and she was, by all accounts, the most captivating woman in the city. The daughter of Lawrence Courtwright, a wealthy and prominent merchant who had made his fortune in the days of the Empire, Elizabeth was a product of New York's upper crust. She was raised in a world of fine silks, imported china, and rigid social etiquette, a stark contrast to the planter society of Virginia that Monroe called home. But Elizabeth was more than just a debutante. She possessed a sharp intellect and a regal bearing that made her seem older than her years. Tall, with dark hair and striking blue eyes, she moved through the crowded ballrooms with a grace that turned heads and silenced conversations. The meeting of James Monroe and Elizabeth Courtwright was not merely a romantic encounter. It was a collision of two worlds, the North and the South, the merchant class and the agrarian gentry, the old wealth of the colonies and the new blood of the Revolution. When they met, likely at one of the grand assemblies that were the heartbeat of New York's nightlife, the attraction was immediate and profound. For Monroe, a man often described as stiff and lacking in small talk, Elizabeth was a revelation. She brought light into his serious world, offering a partnership that promised both warmth and wisdom. For Elizabeth, Monroe represented a different kind of nobility, not one of birthright, but of character. Here was a man who had bled for his beliefs, a man of integrity in a city of opportunists. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of a nation trying to find its footing. While Monroe spent his days wrestling with the inefficiencies of the Articles of Confederation, Arguing over state rights and Western expansion, his evenings were dedicated to Elizabeth. They would have walked the Battery, watching the ships come and go from Europe, discussing not just the gossip of the town, but the future of the country. It is easy to imagine them as a power couple in the making. Even then, Elizabeth's European Polish and Monroe's American grit complemented each other perfectly. The Courtwright family, however, was not immediately sold on the match. Monroe was a patriot, a revolutionary, and while his reputation was honorable, his finances were modest compared to the merchant princes of New York. Furthermore, the shadow of the war still lingered, and the Courtwright family had held loyalist sympathies during the conflict. To marry a Continental Army officer was a bridge across a deep political chasm, but Elizabeth's resolve was as strong as James's. She saw in him the potential for greatness, a vision of the future where they would stand at the center of American life. As the winter of 1785 turned into the spring of 1786, their bond deepened. They were seen everywhere together, the tall, lanky Virginian and the elegant New York belle, becoming a fixture of the capital's social scene. It was a romance that captured the imagination of their peers, a symbol of unity in a divided land. In the drawing rooms of Manhattan, whispers began to circulate, not of scandal, but of an impending union that would join two powerful traditions. For James Monroe, the soldier who had fought for independence, had finally found something, someone, worth fighting for even more. The stage was set, not on a battlefield, but at the altar, for the beginning of a partnership that would one day lead them to the very pinnacle of power. In the social hierarchy of post-revolutionary New York, the Courtwright household was a destination in itself. Lawrence Courtwright, a merchant of immense wealth and influence, had four daughters: Hester, Sarah, Maria, and Elizabeth. They were the talk of the town, each possessing the kind of education and refinement that made them the most eligible bachelorettes in the city. To a young man like James Monroe, fresh from the battlefield and eager to make his mark in the halls of Congress, the Courtwright drawing room must have felt like a daunting arena. Any one of the sisters would have been a suitable match, a strategic alliance that could secure a man's social standing for a lifetime. But James Monroe was not looking for a trophy, nor was he looking for a simple political stepping stone. Amidst the laughter and the music of the city's balls, his attention settled quietly, but firmly, on Elizabeth. She was different. While her sisters were charming, Elizabeth possessed a depth, a certain reserve that mirrored his own. She was described by contemporaries not just as beautiful, but as having a regal bearing, a dignity that commanded respect rather than demanding attention. James saw in her a partner who could withstand the rigors of the public life he was destined to lead. It was a choice of the heart, certainly, but it was also a choice of the mind. He chose the woman who would become his rock. On the morning of February 16th, 1786, the couple stood before the altar of Trinity Church, the Gothic structure rising stoically above the bustling streets of Manhattan. It was a cold winter day, but the church was filled with the warmth of two families coming together. The ceremony was conducted according to the rites of the Episcopal Church, a tradition that would remain central to their lives. As they exchanged vows, it was the merging of two distinct American identities: the rugged Republican idealism of Virginia and the sophisticated mercantile pragmatism of New York. In that moment, James Monroe was no longer just a soldier or a senator. He was a husband, pledging his life to the woman standing beside him in silk and lace. Following the wedding, the newlyweds did not immediately plunge into the frenetic pace of politics. Instead, they retreated to Long Island for their honeymoon. In the late 18th century, Long Island was a world away from the city, a landscape of quiet farms, rolling dunes, and the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the shore. It was here, in the stillness of the winter months, that the foundation of their marriage was truly poured. They spent their days walking, reading, and talking. Away from the prying eyes of the capital, they forged an intimacy that would become their armor against the world. This period of early marriage was defined by a profound sense of shared purpose. When they eventually moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia, so that James could establish his law practice, the transition was stark. Elizabeth traded the cobblestone streets and high society soirees of New York for the dusty roads and quieter life of a southern town. Yet there is no record of complaint, no letters home lamenting her lost luxuries. Instead, she embraced her new role with the same grace she had shown in her father's parlor. She was building a home, not just a house. It is worth noting the singular nature of their bond. In an era where the private lives of public men were often complicated and where marriages were frequently arrangements of convenience, the Monroes stood apart. James was a man of absolute fidelity. His devotion to Elizabeth was total. He did not look for comfort elsewhere, nor did he exclude her from the heavy burdens of his work. She was his confidant, his sounding board, and his greatest supporter. In return, she gave him a loyalty that was absolute. These were the golden years, the years of the man and the woman, before they became the president and the first lady. They were young, they were deeply in love, and in December of that same year, their joy would be multiplied by the birth of their first daughter, Eliza. The sun seemed to shine brightly on the Monroe family, illuminating a path that looked straight and clear. They had health, they had love, and they had a rising nation beneath their feet. But history teaches us that the brightest sun often casts the darkest shadows, and the strength of the bond forged in Trinity Church and solidified on the beaches of Long Island was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. In 1794, James Monroe arrived in Paris as the American minister, stepping directly into the chaotic peak of the French Revolution. The city was under the control of the Committee of Public Safety, and the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution was executing hundreds of people every week. In this dangerous environment, James Monroe faced a diplomatic nightmare regarding the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a hero of the American Revolution, but his noble heritage made him an enemy of the French state. While he was imprisoned in Austria, his wife Adrienne de Lafayette had been arrested in Paris. She was held at the Plessis prison, a notorious holding ground for those awaiting trial and almost certain execution. Her grandmother, mother, and sister had already been beheaded, and Adrienne was next on the list. James Monroe was trapped. As an official diplomat of the United States, he could not demand her release without violating American neutrality and potentially causing a war with France. He needed a strategy that was unofficial, yet impossible to ignore. Elizabeth Monroe stepped forward to execute this plan. She decided to visit Adrienne personally, using her status as an American icon to shield the prisoner. On a tense afternoon, she ordered the official minister's carriage, which was emblazoned with the American crest. She dressed in her most formal attire to signal her rank and rode alone through the crowded, hostile streets of Paris. It was a calculated risk. A mob could have easily attacked a carriage that looked so aristocratic. When Elizabeth arrived at the gates of the Plessis prison, the mood shifted. The jailers in the crowd were stunned to see the wife of the American minister demanding entry, not to inspect the facility, but to visit a friend. The guards, unwilling to cause an international incident with the United States, opened the gates. Inside, in full view of the prison staff and spies, Elizabeth publicly embraced Adrienne de Lafayette. She spoke with her loudly and warmly, ensuring everyone knew that the United States government cared about this woman. The message was clear. If France executed Lafayette's wife, they would be insulting the American people. The political theater worked perfectly. The very next morning, the Committee of Public Safety, intimidated by the beautiful Americans' bold display of support, signed the order for Adrienne's release. Elizabeth had stared down the reign of terror and won. Following their high-stakes service in Europe, the Monroes returned to Virginia, where James's political career continued its ascent. He was elected governor of Virginia, and the family settled into a life of domestic prominence. By 1799, the Monroe household appeared to be a model of American success. They already had a daughter, Eliza, but in May of that year, the family's future seemed secured with the birth of a son, James Spence Monroe. For a Virginia planter and politician in the 18th century, a male heir was not just a child, he was a necessity for the transfer of land, title, and legacy. The governor's mansion was filled with a new energy, and James Monroe began making plans for a future dynasty that his son would one day lead. However, the fragility of life in the 19th century respected no title or rank. In the late summer of 1800, a severe illness swept through the household. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and despite the family's wealth and access to the best doctors in Virginia, nothing could be done. In September 1800, James Spence Monroe died. He was barely 2 years old. The loss was catastrophic. James Monroe, a man who had commanded soldiers and negotiated with empires, was rendered completely helpless, watching his only son fade away. The death of James Spence changed the family forever. Elizabeth, who had been so bold in Paris, was broken by the grief. Her health began a permanent decline, and she started to withdraw from society. This tragedy explains much of her later behavior as First Lady. When she eventually moved into the White House, she was often criticized by Washington society for being aloof or snobbish because she refused to make many social calls. The public did not understand that she was not arrogant. She was a grieving mother who had lost her physical and emotional vitality years prior at the graveside of her son. The couple relied on their Episcopal faith to survive the immediate aftermath, and while they welcomed another daughter, Maria Hester, in 1802, the shadow of the lost heir remained over the family for the rest of their lives. The years following the presidency are often romanticized as a time of well-earned rest, a time to sit by the fire, to write memoirs, and to bask in the glow of a nation built. But for James and Elizabeth Monroe, the reality was far starker. As the couple retired to Oak Hill, their estate in Virginia, the shadows began to lengthen, not just over the lawns of their plantation, but over their lives. The vibrant, steel-spined woman who had stared down the French revolutionaries was fading. Elizabeth's health, which had been fragile since the grief of losing her son years prior, began to deteriorate rapidly in the mid-1820s. The specific medical diagnosis remains a subject of historical debate, often described in the vague terminology of the 19th century as a convulsive illness or a fever of the blood. But the effect was undeniable. She was bedridden, often in pain, and required constant care. James Monroe, the man who had crossed the Delaware with Washington and negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, found himself in a new role, that of a nurse. This devotion was tested in the most public of ways. In 1826, Monroe was offered a prestigious appointment to the Congress of Panama. It was a diplomatic summit of immense importance, designed to foster cooperation among the newly independent nations of Latin America, a cause that Monroe, the author of the Monroe Doctrine, believed in with every fiber of his being. For a statesman, this was the ultimate encore, a chance to cement his legacy on the global stage one last time. He refused. In a letter that reveals the depth of his priority, Monroe wrote that he could not bear to leave Elizabeth in her condition. The man who had spent his entire life serving the state, who had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones for the sake of the Republic, finally drew a line. He chose the woman who had stood by him through the terror of Paris and the politics of Washington. It was a noble choice, but it came at a time when the walls were closing in from another side. The financial ruin of James Monroe is a chapter of American history that is often glossed over. We like to imagine the founding fathers as wealthy aristocrats, secure in their land and titles. But the truth was often one of cash-poor desperation. Monroe had spent 40 years in public service, and in those days, the United States government did not provide expense accounts for its diplomats. When the Monroes entertained European royalty in Paris or London, when they hosted dignitaries at the White House to secure treaties, they often paid for it out of their own pockets. They were purchasing the dignity of the new nation with their personal fortune. By the time they retired to Oak Hill, the bill had come due. The cost of Elizabeth's medical care was astronomical. Doctors were summoned from far and wide, and expensive tonics and treatments were purchased in a desperate bid to ease her suffering. Combined with the collapse of land values and the mismanagement of his plantations while he was away serving the country, Monroe found himself drowning in debt. The irony was cruel. Here was a man who had expanded the territory of the United States by millions of acres, yet he was fighting to keep the roof over his own head. He petitioned Congress for reimbursement for his past diplomatic expenses, a humiliating process for a former president, creating a spectacle where he had to list his debts and beg for what he felt was owed. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, too slowly, to survive and to ensure Elizabeth had the comfort she needed in her final days. Monroe was forced to do the unthinkable. He began selling off his land. His crowning joy, the Highland estate, was lost piece by piece. The legacy he had hoped to leave for his daughters was evaporating, sacrificed on the altar of public service and private tragedy. It paints a somber picture of the era, a reminder that the men and women who built the framework of American democracy often did so at the cost of their own stability. Monroe sat by Elizabeth's bedside, watching the woman he loved fade away, knowing that the country he served had taken everything he had to give: his youth, his energy, and now, his solvency. But looking at James's actions during these dark days, one thing is clear. He did not regret the cost. As long as he could hold her hand, the rest was just land and silver, and they were fading too. The autumn of 1830 brought with it a chill that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. At Oak Hill, the Virginia estate that James Monroe had built as a sanctuary for his retirement, the air was heavy with an impending silence. For weeks, the former president had kept a vigil at the bedside of his beloved Elizabeth, watching the vibrant spirit that had once charmed the courts of Europe and steadied the erratic pulse of a young nation slowly fade into the twilight. On the morning of September 23, 1830, the struggle ended. Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe passed away at the age of 62. For James Monroe, a man who had endured the freezing winters of the Revolutionary War, the chaotic violence of the French Revolution, and the crushing political pressures of the presidency, this was the one enemy he could not defeat. The death of Elizabeth was a devastating blow, one from which he would never recover. History is filled with stories of great men who lose their partners and continue on, driven by duty or ambition. But Monroe was different. His ambition had always been inextricably linked to her presence. She was his confidant, his compass, and without her, the world lost its color. The aftermath of her death revealed the depth of his dependence on her. Almost immediately, the former president's own health began to collapse. It was as if his body, having held itself together through years of financial stress and physical ailments for her sake, finally exhaled and surrendered. The strength that had defined his character, the stoicism of the soldier, evaporated, leaving behind a frail, broken-hearted old man. The grief was so profound that Oak Hill, the plantation he had fought so desperately to keep, became unbearable to him. Every room echoed with her absence. Every view of the rolling Virginia hills reminded him of the walks they could no longer take. The home they had built to grow old and together had become a mausoleum of memories. And so, in a decision that marked the absolute end Of his era as a Virginia dynast, Monroe did the unthinkable. He packed his bags. He abandoned the South. Leaving behind the land of Jefferson and Madison, the land of his birth, Monroe moved north to New York City to live with his youngest daughter, Maria Hester Monroe Gouverneur. It was a symbolic retreat. The last of the founding fathers was leaving the cradle of the Revolution to die in the bustling metropolis of the future. But in his mind, he wasn't moving to a new city. He was simply waiting. Witnesses from those final months in New York described a man who was physically present, but spiritually elsewhere. He spent his days staring out of windows, lost in thought, speaking little of politics or the State of the Union, topics that had once consumed his every waking hour. His correspondence dwindled. The fire in his eyes was gone, extinguished on that September morning at Oak Hill. In the grand narrative of American history, we often focus on the legislative victories and the territorial expansions. But the story of James Monroe's final year serves as a poignant reminder of the human heart beating beneath the statesman's coat. It is a testament to a love so consuming that its end brought about the end of the man himself. He had survived British musket balls and political assassins, but he could not survive a world without Elizabeth. As the winter of 1830 settled over New York, it was clear to everyone who saw him that James Monroe was not trying to live. He was simply counting the days until he could be reunited with the woman who had made his life worth living. The devastating blow had been struck, and the final curtain was already beginning to fall. For decades, Elizabeth Monroe lay in the quiet earth of the garden at Oak Hill, beneath the soil of the plantation that had witnessed both her greatest joys and her deepest sorrows. When James followed her into the silence of death just 1 year later, passing away in the bustling heart of New York City on the 4th of July in 1831, he was initially interred far from her side in the marble cemetery of New York. It seemed a cruel final twist for a couple who had been inseparable in life, to be divided by hundreds of miles in death. The man who had shaped the nation's foreign policy lay in the industrial North, while the woman who had stared down the French revolutionaries rested in the agrarian South. But history, like love, has a way of seeking resolution. In the years that followed, the United States underwent its most bloody transformation. The Civil War tore through Virginia, yet Elizabeth's grave remained undisturbed, a silent witness to the changing tides of the nation she helped found. It was not until the dawn of the 20th century in 1903 that the final chapter of their romance was truly written, not with ink on parchment, but with stone and reverence. Recognizing the deep bond that had defined the Monroes' lives and the significance of their shared sacrifice, the decision was made to reunite them. Elizabeth's remains were carefully exhumed from the solitary grounds of Oak Hill and brought to Richmond, to the hauntingly beautiful Hollywood Cemetery. This was no ordinary burial ground. It was a Valhalla for Virginia's legends, a sprawling garden cemetery named for its abundant holly trees, where the path to eternity winds through rolling hills overlooking the rushing waters of the James River. Here James Monroe had already been reinterred in 1858 beneath an elaborate Gothic revival structure made of cast iron, often referred to as the Birdcage Monument. It is a structure as unique and enduring as his legacy, intricate and imposing, standing as a sentinel over the capital of the Confederacy. In November of 1903, Elizabeth finally joined him. She was placed right beside her husband, under the protective shadow of that same iron canopy, completing a journey that had begun in the candlelit ballrooms of New York over a century before. Standing before their grave today, one is struck not by the grandeur of the monument, but by the simple rightness of their proximity. In a world that often demands a choice between public duty and private devotion, James and Elizabeth Monroe proved that one need not exist without the other. They navigated the treachery of revolutions, the crushing weight of debt, and the devastating loss of children. Yet they emerged from it all with their union intact. The transfer to Hollywood Cemetery was more than a mere administrative act by the state of Virginia or a nod to historical preservation. It was a symbolic restoration of order, acknowledging that while James Monroe belonged to the ages, he belonged first and foremost to Elizabeth. As the wind sweeps off the James River and rustles the ancient trees in the quiet corners of the cemetery, it whispers of a partnership that transcended the birth of a republic. The Monroe Doctrine may have drawn a line around the hemisphere, warning the old world to keep its distance, but the grave at Hollywood Cemetery draws a different kind of circle, one that encompasses two souls who found their true north in each other. They are finally home, together, in the soil of the state they loved, bound by a covenant that neither time nor death could sever. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like and share to support me. See you in the next video. Have a good day.